Welcome to this podcast on burns. Burns are fairly common actually all over the world. They're a common problem in industrial countries, they're a common problem in developing countries. So wherever you work, you're going to come across burns. And excessive heat is perhaps the most obvious cause, leading to thermal injuries. So thermal injuries can be caused by flames, by steam, by hot fluids, by touching hot solids. All these things will impart heat into the tissues, which can cause thermal injuries. And it's worthwhile looking around your environments and thinking about how burns might arise and how they could be prevented. Unguarded fires are an obvious danger to children. Dangling flexes are an obvious danger. Overhanging pan handles are an obvious danger where a child can reach up and pull pull hot fluids or hot food down over their heads or over parts of their body. Older people can be at increased risk as well because of reduced mobility and poor coordination. Often a common feature, as with all accidents, of course, is alcohol intoxication. People that are drunk are more likely to have accidents, more likely to get burned. Now, the severity of a burn depends on the amount of heat and the amount of contact time with the tissues of the body. For example, a temperature of 70 degrees centigrade or more will cause necrosis of pretty well the full depth of the epidermis in just a few seconds. So if things are very hot, they can cause a lot of damage in a short period of time. Hot fat is a classic example. I mean, fat can be at over 200 degrees centigrade, hot cooking oils, and can cause really nasty burns in very small periods of time. But in addition to heat, there's other causes of burns. Radiation can cause burns, as you'll know if you've ever had sunburn. Ultraviolet radiation is the main cause of sunburn. Chemicals can cause burning. Acids or alkalines are examples. Electrical burns are another possibility. When an electric current goes through the body tissues, there is a resistance to that current. And that resistance generates heat. And electrical burns can often affect the deep tissues of the body because the electrical current is transmitted through deep tissues of the body, but is still a cause of burning. Let's think now about the pathophysiology of burns. Now, burns often affect the body surfaces, but of course any tissue of the body can be affected if that tissue is heated up. And the direct effect of a burn will be the death of cells. It will cause tissue necrosis. Now, what actually happens here is that there is an increase in temperature in the tissues. And of course tissues are largely made up of proteins. And when you heat a protein, it will denature and coagulate. So what you get in a burn is coagulation necrosis. There will be coagulation of the proteins, and that will kill the tissues. You might have noticed this if you cook an egg. If you crack an egg and put it into your frying pan, the white part of the egg doesn't start off white, it starts off clear. And that is mostly albumin. The white part of the egg is mostly the protein albumin. But then as you heat it up, it goes from clear to being white. And what is actually happening there is the proteins are denaturing. The heat is breaking up the large, complex proteins. It's changing their nature and causing coagulation. And the same thing happens in a burn. The proteins will coagulate, causing coagulation necrosis. Around about the area of coagulation necrosis, there can be an area of constricted blood vessels with platelet coagulation. That's called the zone of stasis, and that can actually necrose as well over time. And around that there's a painful inflamed area as well. Burns, of course, cause massive inflammatory reactions. Now, when we're thinking about burns, it's good to think about local effects and systemic effects. Let's start off by thinking more about local effects by describing how we classify burns. Now, burns are classified by the depth of skin which is affected by the injury. And the first classification are superficial burns, sometimes called epidermal burns, also called first degree burns actually. So superficial or first degree or epidermal burns, these only affect the epidermis. There is no dermal involvement. Sunburn, for example, will just affect the epidermis. Despite being superficial, these burns can be extremely painful and tender, especially if they're touched. And there'll be a red area, but if you press on that area, it will blanch readily with light pressure. And the reason it will blanch, the reason it will go white with pressure, is because you are squeezing the blood from the dermal blood vessels beneath. And that means that the dermal blood vessels are intact because they're blanching readily. Blistering doesn't usually occur with superficial epidermal burns. And usually they heal fairly rapidly. Because if you think about your anatomy, you've got the epidermis and you've got a germinative layer at the bottom of the epidermis. And if the epidermis, the lower layers of the epidermis are intact, that means that there can be cell division in this germinative layer of the epidermis. And these cells will simply rise to the surface and they will replace the damaged cells, the cells which have been damaged by the epidermal superficial burn. So they heal fairly quickly, and they should heal with, well, they will heal with perfect cosmetic results. The skin will look just as good afterwards. If you burn it repeatedly, of course, with sunburn, for example, you can get progressive skin damage. But from a single episode, it's going to heal as the tissues regenerate from the germinative layer of the epidermis beneath. Now, the next classification of burns are partial thickness burns. Partial thickness burns. And partial thickness burns burn down into the dermis. So they can burn away all of the epidermis and start burning down into the dermis beneath. And it's useful to subdivide this classification into superficial partial thickness burns and deep partial thickness burns. The deep partial thickness burns are also sometimes called deep dermal burns. So superficial partial thickness burns burn through the epidermis and can burn the top of the dermis. Deep dermal burns will burn away a lot of the dermis. They are deep partial thickness injuries. Now, the superficial partial thickness burns can be extremely painful because the nociceptors, the pain receptors, are in the dermis. And if you take away the epidermis, that means that the dermal pain receptors, the dermal nociceptors, are exposed. And that can generate extreme amounts of pain. There's another two characteristics of superficial partial thickness burns which are useful to know about. And one is that the tissues will still blanch if pressure is applied. So if you put a glass on top of the burnt area and press on it, it will still go white, and then when you take your glass off it will go red again, because the blood vessels lower down in the dermis are still intact. So they should still blanch readily. And another characteristic is that these burns generate blisters. Now, a blister is a collection of fluid above the germinative layer of the epidermis. And because these areas have been damaged, you're going to get inflammatory fluids collecting in them. But because the integrity of the tissues is reduced, the tissues aren't going to be sticking together as well, and the fluids can accumulate in tissue spaces, in the dead tissue. So you get a lot of blistering because of the epidermal necrosis and subsequent edema and inflammation forming the inflammatory fluids. Now, as long as these burns are well managed, they should heal very effectively within a couple of weeks, and they should heal with very good cosmetic results. So first of all, the fibroblasts and other cellular components of the dermis will undergo mitosis and secrete their structural products like their collagen and their elastic fibres and the